So, what is the biggest challenge you currently face in making sure all stakeholders are on the same page about the telecom program as it evolves?
Yeah, and so I think the biggest challenge, as we all know, going through the pandemic really just kind of changed the whole landscape in telecommunications. And so I think the biggest thing is that there's so much activity out there. There's so much information out there. There's a lot of alerts. There's a lot of email that's going to leadership's inbox that they're just getting inundated, not only from stuff from the federal government about, hey, there's this new program, there's this new grant, and then you talk about solicitation from vendors and manufacturers, and so there's just a mountain of information that's out there. And I think one of the biggest things that I try to do is try to sift all that down and really create a funnel and say what's important. What really do we need to be paying attention to? And so what I've directed my team and challenged my team to doing is that getting all that information and creating that funnel, if you will, is like, okay, here's the programs in telecom and broadband that we are highlighting and we're going after, and then maybe that first tranche of dollars, and then maybe that second tranche of dollars, or maybe even a third that is kind of on the line or on the bubble that may or may not make sense to us, and really just giving some relief, if you will, to leadership to understand and say, hey, we're taking a look at this. We're holistically looking at this. We know there's a lot of misinformation out there. Maybe it's not misinformation, but maybe there's just a lot of information out there that we just need to sift through and kind of give you some guidance on it. So we really try to boil that down into what we like to call a 2-page executive report, maybe even with some charts and graphs that kind of simplify that so that they're not worried that they're missing something, that they're going to get a call or an email or go to a conference or some sort of summit that somebody speaks on that they feel like that they're missing out. And those things still occasionally happen. But if you're proactive in doing that, then you set yourself up for success.
Thank you. That's great advice. So to kind of switch gears a little bit, how did you make the decision to start Trace Fiber?
Well, we talked a little bit about the original business plan of Trace as far as a middle mile. I think it's probably good to interject is that through that pandemic and through the government, deciding that they're going to attempt to bridge the digital divide, we really had to pivot and really had to change our philosophy, if you will. What did we want to define? What do we want to be when we grow up? Because we were still a very new company at the time. And so that was a very challenging and inspiring moments for us during that period of time is that do we want to be a retail broadband? Would leadership support us being in the retail broadband business? And so again, we had to go back to drawing board. We had to rewrite, if you will, the business plan. And when it came to that piece of it, because now you're taking on from a kind of a limited scope with a wholesale market and going after with high value locations, and now you want to go after maybe lower value but more volume customers. And so the two they're not in opposition to each other. They certainly work together, but there's lots of different things to factor in. The wholesale market, the middle mile market is not as customer centric. You don't have to have as much customer care and support as you do when you turn and you face the customer directly. And so I would encourage anyone that's looking at offering retail broadband directly to not only their tribal citizens, but all citizens alike when you cover a geographic area is that you really spend a lot of time in looking at those support costs, those operational costs when it comes to providing customer care, because that's what's going to differentiate you from another fiber provider, right? If you're in competition with someone else that's putting fiber in, really what it's going to boil down to, you're going to fight over price and you're going to fight over this or that. But what's going to really probably keep the customer sticky and coming back to you is your customer care. And that's something that we take a lot of, we put a lot of attention on that. And we take a lot of pride in being able to provide excellent customer care.
That is a key thing in running an ISP for sure and planning an ISP. Before we really talk about that in our presentation, one thing that we've found, and I mentioned this earlier, is that, it sounds like you are planning for sustainability, but that doesn't mean that your plan stays the same. And so this word sustainability has been thrown out a lot of different ways from a lot of different people. And we've found that it often means something different depending upon who you talk to. So we wanted to understand kind of what does your definition of sustainability encompass and mean in your context?
Well, certainly it has evolved as well. But for me personally, sustainability is, achieving your original goals that you set out in your business plan, the ones that your leadership or your stakeholders, you set out to achieve. Can you achieve those? And at the same time, can you achieve that under the model that you put out there? For us, that was, we had a certain return on investment that we wanted to achieve. So that was important for us. As I mentioned before about the pivot, now you bring that in. And so sustainability there is that can we add this additional customer care and these additional operation expenses and still meet those objectives? And so, I would say that, you never get away from forecasting modeling. You just don't, so you might as well be prepared to build a dynamic model that you can continue to adjust and make adjustments to and modify so that you can layer on the different opportunities. As I mentioned before, is like, hey, here's our priority 1, 2, and 3 from a grant perspective. When someone asks you about sustainability, well, what if this or what if that? And so there's so many factors, and you can't model everything, but you can certainly get it down where you can mitigate the risk. Where if you're asking about sustainability and say, hey, well, what if none of this happened? You can go in and you can turn those levers off, and you can say, well, if none of that happened, then we still reach this ROI, or we still reach this return on asset, or we still have this return, on revenue, and be able to, have that and have substance behind it, and have something that backs that up.
When you pointed out something really important that I wanted to highlight, and that is, if you are not the one creating that business plan and the pro forma and financial modeling, it sounds like that dynamic capability is something that you would want to ask for when you are asking for it to be created, and either would need to be trained to modify it as time goes on, or to maintain that partnership that it will be modified as you go, and that you will have that partner do that. Do you think that's a pretty critical piece if you're going to bother having one created for you?
It's absolutely critical. It's absolutely critical. Is that it is something that will, again, in my almost 7 years of being president of Trace, is something that is updated constantly. Spent a lot of time in that model. It's evolved over time. It's certainly so having that relationship either internally or externally, but being able to have a dynamic model where you can add to that in a way that makes sense, that has your built-in costs and has those again, those drivers, if you will, and assumptions that you can go in and say, okay, let's play the what if game, because that certainly is something that sometimes either drives fear and uncertainty, or it can, what I try to do is try to use that model to displace that and say, well, we've already covered that, and here's how we did it, and here's the assumptions that we used, and here's the drivers that are in the model. Now, if you want us to, take out some of the assumptions, or you want us to change some of these drivers, we can certainly do that. And so that oftentimes alleviates a lot of the concerns and fears that leadership may have about, spending the time and effort, and certainly the amount of money that it takes to stand up a fiber network and provide service.
Great, thank you. So the last question, what is your advice for other tribes to increase their chance of long-term sustainability for their own telecom programs?
Well, certainly we've talked about it. Subject matter expert, someone that has been in that seat before, somebody that has seen some of the things historically, and understands, kind of the potential landmines or pitfalls that are out there. Those are critical in being able to understand the industry as far as what things to avoid, what's important, what's not, because there's some things that you can just put aside, and there's some things that need to be right in front of you, and so being able to understand that, having a good grasp of that, and then really being able to set a vision, and whether that vision is, hey, we're not in this for profit, and that's fine. There's a lot of broadband companies that are set up that way. They're set up either as a co-op or whatever, and their prime objective is to provide a service to their citizens that they don't have today, and that's invaluable. And if that's the case, then you need to spend a lot of time about how many citizens can you impact, and what's the community impact going to be, how is that going to affect potentially the education rates, as far as your at your local high school or your tribal learning institutions, those sorts of things, and then factoring in maybe your healthcare and the impact that it's going to have on life expectancy or longevity when it comes to those sorts of things. I mean, there's some pretty good data around that, and there's some opportunities to really message that to your leadership if that's the role you want to go. Or if you're over here and you say, hey, we want to kind of be in the profit, and we want to, there's some greenfield around our tribal organization, or there's some new development, just adjacent to our reservation, and if we're going to spend the money, inside the reservation, it might offset that if we could just bleed out over here and cover this, existing area that's unserved or particularly underserved, then model that in. And that's when it goes back to is like, you really don't want to, you don't want to take too wide a scope, but you want to take enough of a scope that is appropriate for your objectives and what your leadership team is willing to do. Is that you kind of want to be able to maximize that, because if you look at it just with blinders on, you might be too narrow, but you could also look at it so wide that it might be too much for you to consume or be able to finance.